In 1977, Colleen Stan was kidnapped by Cameron Hooker, a violent sexual sadist.
His goal was to have a perfect slave.
For nearly 7 years, he kept her in a coffin-sized box, abusing and relentlessly torturing her.
He was 6'3". He is putting his whole strength into pulling this chain, and I just thought, I'm gonna die, I can't breathe.
But when Cameron Hooker was brought to trial in 1985, serious doubts emerged as to what had actually taken place.
He was obsessed with bondage, and that really is the only negative thing you can say about this.
I would like to say that I consider this defendant to be probably the most dangerous psychopath that I've ever dealt with.
The case was to shock America and to explore in the most dramatic way the real meaning of consent, coercion, and control. Red Bluff, a small American town in Northern California. It was once famous for its cowboys, but these days it's like the town where time stood still. Nothing much happens here. Most people, like the freight trains and the interstate highway, simply pass through. In May 1977, a young woman called Colleen Stan was hitchhiking through town. Colleen was on a 400-mile journey across California to see her friend. She was an experienced hitchhiker.
Well, I had hitchhiked around town before and never had any problems. And this was in the 70s, and there were quite a few people that hitchhiked then.
She was standing on this junction of Highway 5 on the outskirts of Red Bluff. Being safety conscious, she'd already turned down 2 lifts. But she was now about to encounter a ride that would change her life forever.
This little Dodge Colt, it was blue, like cobalt blue, pulled over, and here was this young couple in it, and the woman was holding a little baby, about 6-7-month-old baby. And I told them, well, I'm going up to Westwood. Are you guys going up there? And they said, yeah, we'll give you a ride.
Colleen had been picked up by Cameron Hooker, his wife Janice, and their 8-month-old baby. Hooker was an unassuming 23-year-old Red Bluff local, a lumberjack.
He looked like he had just gotten off work. He was had greasy hair and greasy clothes, and his wife, or I assumed his wife, and the baby, and I thought, well, this is great.
But within minutes, Colleen was about to discover that the safest-looking ride would turn out to be the most dangerous imaginable.
He is looking in the rearview mirror, like, checking me out. I didn't think it was normal. I didn't want to say anything because I thought these people were gracious enough to stop and give me a ride.
As they stopped at a nearby gas station, Colleen went to the bathroom. A voice in her head began telling her something was very wrong.
It just said to jump out the window and run and never look back. You know, I finally just thought, this is crazy. I went out of the bathroom and went and got back in the car. That was my last chance to escape.
Hooker now drove Colleen to the outskirts of town and stopped the car. His wife Janice and the baby got out, leaving Colleen alone on the back seat.
And all of a sudden he jumps in the back seat from the passenger side and puts a knife up to my throat. I just froze.
Hooker gagged and blindfolded Colleen. Then he pulled out a bizarre wooden contraption, later known as the head box.
There was a hole in the bottom of it that was for your neck, and the thing kind of opened up like a clamshell, you know. He put this head box over my head and then laid me down on the seat.
Hooker had made the head box himself with a specific purpose in mind.
The purpose of the head box was to prevent people from hearing you scream. And it was also a way of blinding the kidnapped person and controlling them.
Hooker now drove Colleen to his house in Oak Street. He removed the headbox and dragged her out of the car and into the back of his house.
And I had to walk up some steps into kind of like a back porch of the house, and he walked me into the house. Then he walked me down some stairs into the basement.
Down in the basement, he stood her on an icebox and tied her wrist to hooks above her.
Then he pulled out the ice chest from underneath me. So I was hanging there, like in the shape of a Y. And of course I was experiencing a lot of pain like I had never experienced before. And then it was at that point that he grabbed a whip and he started whipping me and told me to shut up.
He left her hanging there. Then he dragged her over to a crate-sized box in the corner of the basement and tied her up again.
I got very scared, and I had convinced myself that I couldn't breathe, and so I was just sitting there hyperventilating, and just every breath I thought, this is my last breath, I can't breathe.
Hooker's plan to break Colleen down was now well underway. Down in the basement, she was left bound, gagged, struggling for her life. And her ordeal had only just begun. Colleen Stan had been kidnapped and held overnight in a dark basement in Red Bluff, California. Cameron Hooker, her kidnapper, had embarked on a sinister project to physically and mentally break her down. The next morning, he placed her on his homemade torture rack.
He tied my ankles, one to each corner on the bottom, and put my wrists, one to each corner on the top, and left me there for the day. I didn't understand what was going on, who these people were, or why they were doing these things to me.
As Colleen was being tortured in Red Bluff, 600 miles south in Riverside, her family had begun to realize something serious had gone wrong.
She never, ever didn't make contact with us. And we knew that when she didn't call, something was really wrong.
Colleen's sister Bonnie urged her father to go out looking for Colleen.
They went on a journey up north looking for her. And when they didn't come back with her, that's when I just basically really knew something major was wrong.
Back in the basement at Oak Street, Colleen had spent her first days in total isolation. Hooker repeatedly hung her from the ceiling and whipped her. In the evenings, he would feed her scraps of food before leaving her overnight, chained to his torture rack.
After the first 3 or 4 days on the rack, chained down, he built a box which resembled a coffin, took an old hair dryer, took the heating element out of it and put that in there to suck air into the box so she wouldn't suffocate and die. But she was kept in that box, blindfolded, with chains wrapped around her for 3 or 4 months.
Did you develop any sense of who he was and what he was trying to do to you?
Early on, I understood that he is a sadistic man, and that begging a sadistic person is pretty futile. You're not going to get anywhere. If anything, it gets him more excited and gets him going more than anything.
With no police record and no history of family deviance, Cameron Hooker was, to the outside world, a normal, everyday man. But from an early age, he had become obsessed with bondage and extreme sexual practices, drawing inspiration from violent sadomasochistic magazines. But Hooker wanted to take things further than mere images. He wanted the real thing.
Cameron Hooker was after the perfect slave. He wanted a captive that he could do anything to at any time that he chose to, without any fear of being ridiculed or embarrassed by his request, or without any fear of anyone ever finding out what he'd done.
And that was what Hooker wanted from Colleen Stan, a slave. For month after month, he kept her captive down in the basement, and now, utterly compliant to him, he began to train her, to develop her role. One day, he took her to a corner of the basement he called the workshop.
He had a big burlap sack of walnuts, gave me a nutcracker and a bowl, said, shell these nuts, you know.
So you've been put to work?
Yeah.
Almost 8 months after he had kidnapped her on the highway, Hooker now decided the time had come to formalize Colleen's status as his slave. One night, he went down into the basement and presented her with a contract.
I read through the contract, and I was very upset. I was shaking and crying, and pretty much it said, you know, that I was signing over my body and soul to him.
It was to be a defining moment of her captivity. She was told the almost unbelievable story that by signing the contract, she was to be registered with a powerful network of male slave owners. They operated throughout America and were known as the Company.
Remember, Colleen is told about the company after she'd been in captivity for a year. Remember, she'd been abducted, she'd been brutalized, she'd been kept against her will. He used chains on her and whips and stretchers and head boxes, and he did incredibly horrific things to her. So after the end of a year, he tells her about this company, and he says that they go out and they kidnap young women and keep them as slaves.
Under this bizarre fiction, Hooker now made Colleen believe that any attempted escape and the company would violently hunt both her and her family down.
He really built them up to be this huge organization in my mind, and I totally believed it.
Colleen signed the contract. She was now to be known by her new slave name, Kay, and wear a collar around her neck. She was now officially Cameron Hooker's slave.
I just felt pretty hopeless. I felt like, well, I guess this is my fate, you know? I had gotten myself into this bad situation, and I really didn't know how to get out.
In May 1978, Hooker moved Colleen and his family from Oak Street to a small trailer on the outskirts of Red Bluff. With meticulous preparation, he'd carefully adapted his waterbed to accommodate Colleen.
What Cameron Hooker did was he built a very high pedestal for the waterbed, and he built a box that slid underneath the waterbed.
And you could see holes drilled under the trailer out into the fresh air. Those holes provided fresh air to Colleen when she was in the box underneath their waterbed.
So, just to be correct, this was a box underneath Hooker's bed?
Yes, underneath the waterbed.
And that was where you were kept?
Mm-hmm. I actually had to kneel down on the floor, kind of get down on my belly and kind of crawl in, you know.
How long would you spend in there per day?
Well, generally probably about 22 hours.
The box was a tiny dark space with hardly any room for Colleen to move.
I had a bedpan in there that was down by my feet. If I had to use it, I had to scoot it up with my foot and get it under me, laying flat. It was really hard in the box. I mean, there was several times that I just thought, I just can't do this, not even for another second, you know.
Now, another stage of Hooker's plan unfolded. In the daytime, Colleen was to be let out of the box and set to work in the garden.
He took me outside and gave me a shovel and said, fill in these ditches. And so I filled in the ditches with dirt.
But while she was out working, Hooker was preparing to take his sadistic imagination to yet another level.
Cameron was the type of person that, in my opinion, he had a lot of natural ability to make things. He was very handy, and he could see a picture and diagram of something and reproduce it.
Hooker had built something he called the stretcher.
The stretcher was a 2x8 board with a cross piece, similar to a cross. She had leather cuffs that went around her feet, and he would tighten and pull her body, taut.
He was 6'3". He probably weighed 200 or more pounds, and he is putting his whole strength into pulling this chain, and I was just pulled so tight, and I could not breathe, and my breaths were getting shallower and shallower, and I just thought, I'm gonna die.
All this time, Cameron's wife, Janice Hooker, knew that Colleen was being kept as a slave in the household. In the past, she too had been a victim of his sadism.
We do know that at a very young age, she began her relationship with Cameron Hooker. We know that he was very dominant in that relationship. And we know that they struck this horrific deal.
The deal was that Hooker could keep a slave to perform his bondage on, but must never have sex with her. And in return, Janice would no longer be subjected to S&M with her husband.
He had to have her permission because she was going to be kept in the house, and that she would be the recipient of the whipping and the painful bondage that Janice was having to go through, and that Janice would no longer have to do that.
As time wore on, Colleen's plight became more and more bizarre. In between torture and captivity in the box, her domestic chores grew.
He wanted to bring her into the household. He wanted her to be able to help out around the house, and eventually, if she became a good slave, to allow her to take care of the children and to do the things that he wanted her to do.
By now, Janice had a second child, and Colleen began to assume the role of family nanny.
He let me start watching the children while they were away at work. I cleaned house and did dishes and all those kind of things. I did some of the cooking.
Hooker now allowed Colleen little freedoms. She was even allowed to go out of the trailer, jogging.
She was allowed certain liberties, and one of those liberties was to be able to go jogging. And he would time her, and he would allow her different amounts of time to go jogging and run back and forth.
Why didn't you just run away?
Because I truly believed in the company. He had implied that, there were other members of the company living in the area, like in the neighborhood, and basically they told me, go ahead.
But Colleen's little freedoms concealed yet another awful stage of her ordeal. While Janice was out working in Red Bluff, Hooker was breaking the deal he'd made with her and was sexually abusing Colleen.
Every time he sexually assaulted me, I would bleed because, of course it wasn't like having normal sex. I was not ready for it. And one time he sodomized me. But thank God that only occurred one time.
By 1980, 3 years after the kidnap, Hooker's confidence was growing. With Colleen fully trained up as his slave, he now began to really test the limits of his control over her. One day, he announced that he was going to let her phone home. He drove her into Red Bluff to make the call.
He was standing right there with his hand on the receiver, If you say anything, I don't want you to say, I'm cutting off the phone, and then you're going to pay. You're going to be in trouble.
Colleen had not been in contact with her family for more than 3 years.
I phoned, and my sister Bonnie answered the phone. I don't think she recognized my voice at first.
There was a pause. I said, hello. And then I heard a voice. It sounded from a distance because it was long distance. And it was her. It was my sister.
So she was very excited. He only let me speak to her for maybe 2 minutes.
But she didn't sound like she was okay over the phone. She was upset. She was not just her regular self.
Soon afterwards, he was to announce something extraordinary. Colleen was to be allowed home to visit her family.
He had told me that it was kind of a precedent, but that the company had approved for me to go home and visit my family.
Hooker drove Colleen 600 miles south to Riverside. On the way, he prepped her for the visit.
He told me to tell my family that he was my boyfriend, that his name was Mike. No, that he was my fiance, actually. We were going to get married.
And all the time, he made sure that she knew the price for not playing her role.
He told her that the company was monitoring the visits, that they were everywhere, that they had bugged the house, and that if she did anything wrong, they were going to torture and kill her family.
On the 20th of March 1981, Hooker dropped Colleen off at her parents' house.
She had homemade clothes on. That was not like the character of my sister. Oh no, and she was thin. She was thin. That's not like my sister either.
Despite the suspicions, none of her family wanted to confront Colleen.
We were too scared to push her, you know, for fear that we didn't know if she was in a cult and there were people all around her, and we knew she was under stress, though, I can tell you that. I mean, it was very visible.
I didn't want to push her to, because I was afraid if it was a cult or something, you know, that we would never hear from her again.
Did you want to tell them the truth?
Oh yeah, I wanted to scream it out, but I too was so afraid, you know, because I was afraid for their safety. I was afraid for my own safety, because I truly believed in the company, and I truly believed that these people were backing this guy up.
Despite the fear, these pictures taken during the visit show a happy, relaxed Colleen. For the first time in 4 years, she was back with her family.
I mean, on the outside, it looks like a happy family photograph.
Mm-hmm.
What was going on inside?
Well, it was a happy family photograph because I was very happy to have those moments with my family, because I was in such a state of not knowing what was coming next and what was going to happen next. I didn't know when it ended if I'd ever see him again. So it was all very precious to me.
The happiness was to be short-lived. Just 24 hours later, Colleen got a phone call.
They were like, oh, it's Mike, you know, and so I got on the phone and he said, I'm coming to get you. And I kind of argued with him because I said, well, but I thought, almost exactly 24 hours to the hour, he was back.
After almost 4 years of captivity, Cameron Hooker had allowed Colleen a visit home to see her family. But despite years of being tortured and abused, she was simply too frightened to tell them the truth of her ordeal back in Red Bluff. And just 24 hours after he had dropped her off, Cameron Hooker was back at the front door.
He just looked like, you know, an average person.
He just looked like a bookworm of some sort. He was not her type at all. He did not appear evil whatsoever. He had me fooled, I'll tell you.
And as Colleen was getting ready to leave with Hooker, she posed for this picture with him.
Can I ask you about the photograph?
Mm-hmm.
And looking to all intents and purposes like you were very happy to do that.
I was very happy to be with my family.
I'm talking about the photograph with him.
It wasn't because I was happy with him, no. I felt that I had to act like he was my fiance, you know? This was the man I wanted to marry, even though that was very far from the truth. Guess I win an Academy Award for that one.
In allowing Colleen home and watching her play her role to perfection, Hooker had now achieved the most extreme form of control over his slave.
It's called grandiose control. It just goes beyond control. It goes to absolute control over another person when you can let them out of your sight and know that they're not going to rebel against you.
And that's what Hooker did by
And that's what Hooker did, by allowing her to work and to go home and visit the family. What a sense of power.
Colleen now began to say her farewells.
When I said goodbye to her, it broke my heart because I knew that she was going back into something that was really bad. And I wish now I would have just grabbed her and told her, you're not going anywhere, but that's hindsight now.
Within minutes, the brief family visit was over, and Colleen was about to enter yet another extraordinary phase of her captivity.
So I hugged and kissed everybody and told them all that I loved them, and we left. Well, unbeknownst to me, when we got back to Red Bluff, he snuck me in the house, put me in the box back under the bed, and that was pretty much where I remained for the next 3 years.
Back in the trailer, she would pay an almost unbelievably cruel price for her 24 hours of freedom.
She came back from that trip to Riverside to see her family. He put her back in the box because he was afraid he was losing some control.
She was there for almost 3 years, and his own 2 daughters didn't know that she was in the trailer.
They had 2 young girls, and for those 3 years, not even the girls knew that I was there. So I was locked away in this box under the bed. Occasionally, when Jan and the girls were gone, he would take me out and torture me or rape me and do things, but never when they were around.
And she was like that. She did that for 3 years. 3 years.
All through those years, no one outside the trailer had any idea that Colleen was locked up inside, underneath the waterbed. The neighbors thought that Kay, the hard-working nanny, had simply gone away. Then, in early 1984, everything changed. Colleen was suddenly given some dramatic news.
Out of the blue, the company had approved it, and it was okay for me that I could get out of the box.
Hooker had now decided to allow Colleen back into his little world.
And reintroduced me, you know, that I was, oh, look, Kay's back, you know, to the neighbors and the children and everybody.
Incredibly, he now allowed Colleen to get a job as a receptionist at the local motel.
The only reason that they allowed her to go to work was they needed the money. They were short on money, and she agreed that she would go to work for them. It was a liberty for her.
You still thought of yourself as a slave, though?
Well, because I was.
So you still, every day, thought that the company were a real threat?
Yes, I did.
Back in the trailer, Colleen began to study the Bible, and through it, she began for the first time to form a bond with Janice Hooker.
We started to develop, at least on a spiritual level, a relationship.
Around this time, Hooker had begun to scale down his abuse of Colleen, but his attacks on his wife Janice were increasing.
We found 500 photographs of Janice, Cameron's wife, being tortured, being hung on the back of the doors, being hung on the frame.
Sometimes Hooker would even expect Colleen to keep the children away while he attacked his wife.
There was one particular time he was in there, he had her tied down to the bed or something, and he was whipping her, and she was crying out and crying, and the girls heard her, and they said, "Kay, why is Mommy crying?" And I was so mad, and I thought, that bastard, how could he do this?
It was now 1984, 7 years after the kidnap, and the pressure on Janice was starting to show. Hooker had told her that he was considering kidnapping another 4 slaves.
She was afraid that he was going to kidnap and bring in other women. And also she was fearful for her 2 little girls because they were getting older. She didn't know what he was going to do to them, if anything. She didn't know what was going to happen when they found out.
At the local church, Janice had befriended the pastor. One day she told him the truth about her husband. Appalled, he told her that she was living in sin and that she had to leave. And after 7 long years, Janice finally snapped.
She came to my work one day, and she told me, "We have to get out of here." And she said, "Cameron's not in the company."
It had taken just one small truth to destroy the premise on which Colleen had been living for the last 7 years.
I thought, my God, how could I be so stupid? How could I have bought into this lie for all these years? And then also, of course, I was questioning, why did you wait so long to come to me with the truth? Why didn't she tell me this way back 7 years ago?
Did you ask her that?
No.
Colleen was stunned, but she now had to decide what she was going to do next.
Then, of course, I had to snap out of it because it was like, okay, now we have to come up with a plan. How are we going to get out of here and, with our lives and get away from this guy?
Now free of her fear of the company, Colleen decided to head back to her family. But before she left, she felt compelled to make one final call to her captor and tormentor of 7 long years.
I called him from the bus station, and he was at home, and he was pretty much crushed because his world had come falling down on him. And I told him, "I'm getting on the bus and I'm leaving, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." And he cried like a baby. And I hung up the phone, and I got on the bus, and I left. For the first time in over 7 years, I was in control of my life again.
Soon the police were called to Hooker's trailer. He had destroyed most of the torture equipment, but some remained.
We located hooks mounted on the ceiling inside the trailer that the frame, which was used to torture Colleen, was attached to.
It was shocking stuff, but not enough to indict Hooker. Then Al Shamlin discovered 2 rolls of undeveloped film hidden in the trailer. They contained the vital evidence, images of the rack, the contract, and crucially, of Colleen being hung on his wooden frame. Hooker was arrested, and in November 1984, 8 years after kidnapping Colleen, he was finally brought to trial. He was charged with 17 counts of rape and sodomy. And as Colleen took her place in the courtroom, she faced her one-time captor for the first time since her nightmare had ended.
Here he's sitting like 10 feet in front of me with this smirk on his face the whole time, like, I'm going to get off and then I'm coming to get you.
Chief Prosecutor Christine McGuire opened the trial by dramatically unveiling the range of equipment that he had used on Colleen.
It is a doubled box. It was located in one of the yellow outbuildings. It just literally goes over your head and then closes up.
There was the stretcher, the chains, and the handcuffs. And Maguire had built a replica of the most shocking evidence of all, the box beneath the bed.
We found the box that had been under the bed, and we reconstructed it, and we placed it in the middle of the courtroom, and it sat there day after day after day.
But while Hooker was being portrayed in court as an evil criminal, to members of the jury, he came over as just a regular Joe.
Cameron seemed meek and like mild, just seemed like a country boy. He just sat there and he didn't look like the strong, evil man.
And in defense lawyer Roland Papendick, Hooker had found someone who really believed in him.
Do I like Cameron Hooker? Yes, I do. He didn't swear, he didn't drink, he didn't do drugs. Went to work every day, raised a family. He was obsessed with bondage, and that really is the only negative thing you can say about this.
Hooker's defense was straightforward.
The defense was that Colleen Stan was an adult and that she had the capacity to form the mental state of consent.
Put simply, Hooker admitted to kidnapping Colleen, but maintained that the sex with her wasn't rape, but consensual.
You can't have consensual sex with a slave. It's impossible.
Why not?
Because that person is your slave. She's there against her will. Just the mere act of having sex with her when she's there against her will is a crime.
But Papendick argued that Colleen had many chances to escape. During her times outside the trailer, whilst jogging, and of course during her visit home. The fact she hadn't taken any of them proved she had stayed with him of her own free will. The company was just a figment of her imagination.
So I think sometimes things get embellished.
The defense's assertion that Colleen is effectively lying.
Exaggerating, definitely.
She believed that his father was a member of the company, that his brother was a member of the company. She believed that the neighbors down the street were a member of the company. She believed that the company was everywhere. And she believed that if she left, then the company would hunt her down and kill her.
As unbelievable as it sounds, in my mind, I totally believed all these things. If someone doesn't believe it and they think this is all hogwash, they're free to believe that.
But as Colleen maintained that her belief in the existence of the company was true, Papendick presented his most shocking evidence. An astonishing series of letters written by Colleen to Hooker in which she declared her undying love for her supposed captor. The letters were to stun the courtroom and to turn the whole trial on its head. The trial of Cameron Hooker had seemed a certainty. But the disclosure of Colleen's love letters to him had shocked the prosecution and turned the whole case on its head.
When they brought the love letters into it, I remember questioning that maybe she did seem to fall in love with him and she did want a life with him and that she did want to stay with him.
The letters had cast serious doubts on the credibility of Colleen's story. If she really had been so abused, how could she possibly have written such affectionate words to her captor?
I love you more than words could ever say. Kay, you fill my life with happiness and love. I pray that happiness and love will never end. Love, Kay. Do you remember writing that?
I remember he took me into the back bathroom and he chained me to the toilet. He gave me a big pad of paper and a pen, and he said to write him a love letter, and so I did. If you really think about all of that, you know, would a free and willing person have to be chained to the toilet and given these things and told what to write? I think not.
Revealingly, Colleen had signed the letters under her slave name.
She didn't sign it Colleen. She signed it with her slave name, which was just the letter K. Now, what kind of card is that? I mean, that is a card that is written by a slave to her master. Yet another piece of very shocking evidence that said that she was being held against her will.
But even if Colleen had been under pressure to write the letters, it was clear that she had also formed some kind of a bond with Cameron Hooker.
When the relationship started to develop into more of a love relationship, I guess, for lack of other
Into
words.
what relationship?
Into more of a love relationship. Well, then he treated me better. These people were my life, and for all these years, and so yes, there was a connection, and there were feelings. I mean, we all have feelings. It doesn't matter what kind of situation you're in, you have feelings. You know, they're good or bad or whatever.
Colleen's feelings for Hooker presented a major dilemma for the prosecution. How could they explain such emotions to a man as violent and abusive as Cameron Hooker? Christine McGuire called in captivity expert Dr. Chris Hatcher, who explained to the court how in kidnapping Colleen, Hooker had actually carried out a textbook abduction.
What Dr. Hatcher said is, first you have this sudden, unexpected abduction. Of course, that's what we know happened to Colleen.
Dr. Hatcher explained to the court how the process develops.
You degrade them, you torture them, you remove them from society, you remove all sense of day and night, all sense of weeks and years, and you do all these incredible things to them, so you get them to the point where you're actually able to break them.
And that's what Cameron Hooker did. He broke Colleen's will. And once he'd done that, she adopted the classic behavior of the master-slave relationship. She tried to please him, and showing love was a way of doing that.
The more love I showed towards him, the better he treated me.
She didn't have the kind of love two people should have for one another. It wasn't that kind of a love. It was just the attachment that comes with proximity under horrific conditions, dependency.
It was a very unhealthy kind of love. And it was more a love of necessity, you know, because this man was holding my life in his hands.
For Colleen, showing her love was nothing less than a way of surviving.
So I think the love was more that I was just grateful that I still had my life, because that was the only thing I still had. I didn't have my freedom.
I have videotapes of victims with their captors. I have audio tapes of other victims with their captors, and I can tell you they worked very, very hard to, quote, please, end quote, their captor. Verbally, sexually, physically. They worked very hard. Why? They want to live.
After 5 weeks, the jury was sent out to make their decision.
I think everybody felt that he was, guilty of it. It was only the question of Colleen falling in love with him, if there was a period of time where she willingly stayed.
At the center of the jury's deliberations was whether Hooker really had exerted control over Colleen during her whole time with him.
And basically it ended up, we felt she was under his control the entire 7.5 years.
And were they unanimous decisions?
Yes.
Cameron Hooker was found guilty and sentenced to 104 years in jail.
I would like to say that I consider this defendant to be probably the most dangerous psychopath that I've ever dealt with, if for no other reason that he appears to be exactly the opposite of what he is.
There was absolutely no remorse. There was just no sense of the horror that he had done to another person.
Colleen had finally received justice, but Hooker had one final parting shot as she watched him led to the cells.
He was not smirking, he was not smiling, he was looking like it was the end for him. He did blurt out in the courtroom, "I should have killed her." because he knows dead people don't talk.
Today, Colleen has rebuilt her life. She lives in Northern California and has a 20-year-old daughter. She works as an advocate, helping women who've suffered sexual and domestic abuse. And despite all that's happened to her, she sees herself as a survivor.
Well, you know, I chose life. I chose life, and I chose to try to pick out the positive things and go with that and not be destroyed by all this. And so that's what I've done.